You are about to cross into a world where fear is real. Real stories, unexplained phenomena, where the supernatural lurks in the shadows. From the portal of dread.
Today's story, the house that breathes fear. Greetings, eerie visitors. Welcome to the gateway of terror. Prepare to cross the boundary between the tangible and the inexplicable. Dim the lights, put on your headphones, and get comfortable. Because tonight, together, we'll delve into a new chapter of terror. Are you ready for the unknown? Then like, subscribe, and leave a comment saying, "I'm not afraid." Now let's begin. Have you ever paused to consider if the reality your eyes perceive is, in fact, the only one that exists? Or if, beyond the veil of the familiar, lurks a dimension where the most profound terrors take form, feeding upon our very existence? In 2018, in the quiet Messejana district of Fortaleza, a series of unsettling events began to challenge this perception, weaving a chilling narrative that few dared to document, yet many felt in their very bones. Imagine an ancient house, a legacy spanning decades, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of mold and something more. Something undefinable, subtly sweet, that seeps into your very bones. There, sounds became detached from any logical source, whispers that weren't voices, but the very air itself groaning and creaking, echoing forgotten secrets. Formless apparitions danced at the periphery of vision, distorting the flickering lamplight, while reflections in antique mirrors revealed visages that were not one's own. Each night, an inexplicable chill intensified, even amidst Sierra's oppressive heat, accompanied by an overwhelming pressure in the chest, as if the very edifice itself breathed a heavy, fear-laced air. These were no mere hallucinations. They were shared experiences by those who inherited the property, thrusting them into a dreadful dilemma: to confront the literal manifestation of decades of accumulated nightmares, risking sanity and life in a struggle against the intangible, or to yield, allowing this shadowy entity to proliferate, devouring not only the house, but anyone who dared to approach. Would you possess the courage to plunge into this abyss, or would the mere thought compel you to question the very solidity of the ground beneath your feet? Amidst this charged atmosphere were Márcio, a 48-year-old mathematics professor, and his wife, Marise, an attorney of the same age. Rational individuals, accustomed to logic and the concrete, both viewed the world through lenses of cause and effect. The inheritance of that house in Messejana, which had belonged to their grandfather who passed away at 103, initially seemed like a blessing in disguise. The old man was known for his reclusiveness and eccentricity. Rumors of his involvement with the occult were dismissed as mere family lore, something to be disregarded. For Márcio and Marise, the property represented an opportunity for a more serene future, to sell the estate, invest the proceeds, and plan an early retirement. The notion of residing there was unthinkable, yet bureaucracy mandated a visit to assess the house's condition before listing it on the market. The first time they crossed the rusty iron gate and stepped inside the residence, a palpable sense of oppression enveloped them. It was an ancient edifice with Gothic architecture that seemed incongruous in the Fortalezense landscape, almost a scar etched in time. The interior was shrouded in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The heavy, dark furnishings seemed like specters from a bygone era. Marise, ever practical, began to enumerate the necessary repairs, while Márcio, with his more discerning eye, noticed subtle symbols carved into wooden beams and door frames, which he initially ascribed to the deceased's mere aesthetic idiosyncrasies. Both concurred that the discomfort was merely the burden of history in such an ancient and neglected place. However, as the days they spent organizing and cleaning progressed, the signs began to manifest in more unsettling ways. The temperature within the house fluctuated without discernible cause. Cold drafts materialized in sealed rooms, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls, readily attributed to the wind or the aging structure. Objects, such as an antique book on the shelf or a drawer in the study, were found subtly displaced, something they stubbornly insisted on categorizing as forgetfulness. Marise spent hours on the phone attempting to expedite the sale, while Márcio dedicated himself to cataloging the belongings, hoping to unearth something of value that might hasten the process. The true turning point occurred on a particularly stifling night. Márcio, poring over some old diaries belonging to his great-uncle, swore he saw a dense shadow swiftly glide against the dim light of the bedside lamp, a movement that defied all physical logic. At that very instant, Marise, in another room, heard the muffled cry of a child emanating from upstairs, yet there were no children present, nor even any close neighbors. Both attempted to rationalize these occurrences, attributing them to fatigue or the evocative power of the surroundings, but the seed of doubt had been irrevocably sown. It wasn't long before Márcio, investigating a false wall in the basement, discovered a hidden compartment. Inside, there were no treasures, but rather a series of inscrutable schematics, intricate drawings, and a strange metallic device seemingly connected to pipes that snaked throughout the house, alongside notes on capture of nocturnal emanations and oniric energy, which would chill them to the bone, even under Fortaleza's blistering heat. The discovery of that secret compartment transmuted initial curiosity into icy dread. His great-uncle's notes were not merely the ramblings of an eccentric. They were the meticulous records of an occultist who, it seemed, had constructed a machine dedicated to manipulating the very essence of nightmares. The machine itself, an intertwined mass of copper tubing and aged crystals, seemed to pulse with a latent energy, even in its deactivated state. Márcio, with his analytical mathematician's mind, attempted to decipher the complex diagrams, while Marise, the lawyer, read excerpts from the diaries with a burgeoning mixture of revulsion and fascination. The writings spoke of energetic capture of fear, of harvesting nocturnal anguish to transmute nightmares into a form of pure energy, capable of sustaining something unimaginable. What they did not realize was that this energy, accumulated over decades, now permeated every room of the house, rendering it a living reservoir of terrors. Initially, they endeavored to dismiss the darker implications of the discovery, attributing it to their great-uncle's madness. However, the occurrences began to escalate. Márcio, in his dreams, was haunted by amorphous figures that seemed to slither from the walls, while Marise beheld distorted reflections of herself in every polished surface, her features contorted into expressions of pure despair. The voices, once indistinct whispers, now manifested as direct taunts, aimed at their most intimate fears. The house was not merely ancient, it was alive, and its vitality stemmed from pain. They attempted to sell the house again, but each potential buyer experienced an inexplicable chill upon entering, fabricated excuses, or simply vanished. It seemed the house resisted being sold, or that something within it prevented anyone from drawing too near. With each frustrated attempt to divest themselves of the property, the atmosphere grew denser, the putrid, cloying scent more potent. The shadows were no longer mere peripheral glimpses. They coalesced into form, solidifying in the corners of the rooms, observing. On one particularly terrifying night, Márcio awoke with the sensation of being suffocated by invisible hands, while Marise, in her own room, a disturbing scratching sound emanated from within the wardrobe, as if something was attempting to escape. They attempted to rationalize, of course, but the escalating frequency and intensity of these phenomena rendered denial increasingly untenable. This was not merely the inheritance of a house, but the legacy of a problem that manifested tangibly, a psychic infestation demanding more than a mere cleanup or renovation. Their great-uncle's device, that collector of nightmares, seemed to be the nucleus of it all, a mechanical heart-pumping horror throughout the entire structure. They had to comprehend its operation, or discover a means to cease its function, before the house utterly consumed them. The escalation of terror compelled Márcio and Marise to confront the stark reality. The machine was not merely dormant, it was pulsating, nourished by decades of accumulated fears, and now the nightmares were manifesting with increasing aggression and personalization. The shadows lurking in the corners of the rooms were no longer mere phantoms. They were nascent figures, molding themselves to their deepest anxieties. Márcio, who had always grappled with the anxiety of failure, witnessed his classroom being invaded by students with contorted faces, mocking his perceived ineptitude as the blackboard filled with nonsensical equations that drove him to the brink of madness. Marise, who dreaded losing control, observed herself in states of uncontrollable despair, her voice distorted and echoing through the vacant corridors, indicting her for past failings. The air was perpetually cold, dense, and the house's sweet, putrid scent now permeated their clothes, their skin adhering to them even when they attempted to escape the property for a few hours. Their collective sanity began to fray. Marise, formerly composed and analytical, grew irascible, her arguments with Márcio becoming frequent and fraught with unfounded accusations, a stark reflection of their toxic surroundings. Márcio, conversely, was perpetually exhausted, his eyes sunken, haunted by nightmares that now infiltrated his waking hours, leading him to question the veracity of his perceptions, whether they were real or merely hallucinations induced by the house. Their great-uncle's machine appeared to possess a sentient will, reacting directly to their emotional states, amplifying fear and anguish to sustain itself. They attempted to sever its connection, but the wires seemed fused to the very framework of the house, and each endeavor to break the link unleashed a wave of terror that compelled them to retreat, as if the house would defend itself. They uncovered, through an even more recondite journal of their great-uncle, that the machine not only amassed nightmares, but also projected them back, as a kind of energetic reflux, molding them into corporeal or psychic manifestations to intensify the harvest. The esotericist's aim was to forge a portal, a nexus between reality and the realm of oniric terrors, seeking an inexhaustible fount of power. The journal also divulged a dreadful truth. The apparatus could not simply be deactivated or obliterated without catastrophic repercussions. It was inextricably linked to the very bedrock of the house, and perhaps to the dimension where nightmares held sway. To dismantle it would unleash decades of accumulated terrors in one fell swoop, perhaps eternally, or even graver, collapse the very fabric of reality around them. Escape was not an option. They had come to realize that the contagion was not confined to the physical edifice of the house. The visions and sensations pursued them, even when they dared to venture out for a few hours. The terrors evinced themselves in the gazes of strangers, in the city's distorted cacophony, and in the shadows that seemed to swell to monstrous proportions behind them. Their great-uncle's grim legacy was not a mere material encumbrance, but a malevolent curse clinging to their very souls. The house had transmuted into an inescapable prison, for that which haunted them had already taken root within their very beings. Their sole hope, however tenuous, was to unravel the machine's true essence and somehow to reverse the insidious process, or else imperil their lives in a conclusive confrontation, knowing that failure would portend the complete forfeiture of their sanity or, even more dreadfully, the materialization of something they dared not even articulate. Reality, now warped and permeated by the accumulated terrors, inexorably propelled them toward the abyss. There was no conceivable way to disregard the machine or its manifestations. Márcio, with his discerning, logical mind, concluded that the sole means of survival lay in comprehending their adversary. They endured countless sleepless nights poring over their great-uncle's abstruse diagrams and cryptic annotations. Marise, for her part, leveraged her jurisprudential insight to decipher the archaic symbols and veiled allusions pervading the texts, unveiling an even more macabre truth: that the machine not merely harvested nightmares but refined them, concentrating the quintessence of terror into a pulsating energy that sustained the house itself, almost as a vital organ. Should it be abruptly disengaged, the unleashing of this contained energy could obliterate the mind of any near them, or worse, tear the very fabric of reality, opening a permanent portal to the realm of terrors. The machine, an intricate structure beneath the ground, was the pulsating heart of the curse. It was not merely a device, but an extension of the occultist's own will, infused with his obsession. Manifestations of their deepest nightmares became constant. Márcio saw mathematical figures contorting into grotesque forms, while Marise was tormented by the faces of victims she had failed to protect in her past. The mental strain was unbearable, but the imperative to fight for sanity and survival was even greater. They discovered that their great-uncle had left a deactivation protocol, hidden in a final compartment, accessible only after deciphering a series of psychic enigmas, each one triggering a more intense manifestation of the nightmares. The final confrontation unfolded at the apex of a storm, lightning illuminating the house's corridors with flashes that exposed the shadow's grotesquerie. Each resolved enigma brought a fresh wave of terror. The floor writhed, the walls bled dark ichor, and voices escalated into deafening screams. Márcio and Marise, hand in hand, confronted their darkest projections, their minds pushed to the brink. Finally, they reached the last enigma, which revealed how to deactivate the containment mechanism and gradually release the energy without collapsing reality. It was a race against time, with the house violently resisting, attempting to thwart them. With an act of sheer courage and desperation, they managed to activate the protocol. A deafening hum filled the house, followed by a metallic clank and an unsettling quietude. The machine ceased its pulsating, the pipes grew cold, and the sweet, putrid odor began to dissipate. The house, once alive with horror, now seemed hollowed out, inert. They had succeeded, but at an incalculable cost. Márcio and Marise emerged from the basement, pallid, utterly spent, their eyes having witnessed sights that could never be unseen. The house still stood there, in Messejana, but it was no longer the same, nor were they. Although the visible terrors had abated, the memory of their ordeal etched itself upon their souls, an invisible scar. Sometimes on sleepless nights, they still felt a chilling tremor, a distant whisper, and would wonder, had the darkness truly vanished or merely receded into the recesses of their minds, awaiting its next opportunity to manifest? The collector's legacy. The nightmare was contained, yet for Márcio and Marise, the very frontier between the tangible and the oniric had been irrevocably effaced. Have you ever felt the air's oppressive weight constricting around you, as though the very walls of a space were no longer mere physical barriers, but rather the embodied memory of something suffocating? In certain locales, darkness transcends a mere absence of light, manifesting as a frigid, palpable presence that permeates one's very marrow. There exist truths concealed within the very viscera of our world, truths that murmur from forgotten recesses, particularly within an ancient house in Messejana, Fortaleza, in the year 2018. Those who ventured within encountered air thick with an cloying, putrescent odor, a scent redolent of aged mildew commingled with something more, something profoundly organic and macabre. It was as if the edifice itself respired, exhaling a miasma composed of decades of accumulated anguish. The inaugural harbinger came in the form of auditory phenomena, creaks that seemed to issue not from the timber, but from an animate structure, inaudible whispers that appeared to emanate directly from the very shadows. Márcio, the mathematics professor, a man anchored by numbers and certitude, commenced documenting the inexplicable in his personal journal. Day 14. The pervasive cold persists, even beneath the Sieren's sun. I distinctly recall witnessing something stir at the periphery of my vision, a nebulous dark distortion that warped the light. Marise, my wife, attributes it to exhaustion, but I am convinced otherwise. I experience a constricting pressure in my chest, as though the very air is being siphoned away. That dwelling was not merely ancient, it was thoroughly imbued, pulsating with an energy that utterly defied rational comprehension. A report, dated 1970, unearthed amongst antiquated possessions, referenced the erstwhile proprietor, a recluse with interests in unconventional energies and the capture of nocturnal emanations. Was this the mere delirium of a lone man, or indeed the genesis of a profound horror? Imperceptibly, the demarcation between nightmare and wakefulness began to dissolve for them. Marise, the attorney, renowned for her impeccable logic, began to recount distorted reflections on polished surfaces, visages of abject terror appearing where their own countenances ought to have been. Objects would displace themselves unaided, and the ambient temperature would plummet precipitously. This was no ordinary haunting. It was an entity that preyed upon the very psyche, a collector of psychic residue. The great-uncle, the aforementioned recluse, had constructed a device, an abhorrent contraption of copper and crystal, designed to transmute terrors into kinetic energy. Decades of nightmares, of profound anguish, and the most intimate of fears, all meticulously ensnared and amplified, now merely awaited an opportune moment for liberation. It is a danger I am acquainted with, a horror I have relentlessly researched. The walls of this house harbor not merely secrets, but an ancient hunger. And however much I have endeavored to unravel it, certain doors ought to remain sealed, for knowledge of this caliber can be as fatal as the very menace it describes. The grim legacy of their great-uncle Márcio and Marise had come to realize was more profound than they had imagined. Delving into the diaries and personal archives of the elder Elias Vargas was akin to prying open a gateway to a temporal abyss, unveiling the genesis of that terror. Elias, a recluse who styled himself an oniric architect, commenced his experiments in the 1960s. Driven by an obsession with metaphysics and the human psyche, he posited that fear, in its purest form, was an underutilized energy, a vast and unexplored resource. His rituals did not entail blood, but rather an intricate tapestry of chants in forgotten tongues, deep meditation in states of sensory deprivation, and the manipulation of sleep patterns. Elias would spend entire nights in a self-induced trance, documenting the region's collective nightmares, visualizing its most intimate terrors, and progressively learning to harness this energy. The machine, which he dubbed the Anima Nox Colector, the collector of the night soul, was constructed upon an ancestral energy convergence point, a site sacred to ancient indigenous tribes of Messejana, which Elias co-opted for his sinister aims. He perceived it not as an object, but as a vessel, a catalyst for channeling the very anguish of the collective unconscious into a continuous flow. Yet Elias's words, disturbing as they were, constituted but one piece of testimony. The house itself, and what manifested within it, offered undeniable evidence that Márcio and Marise, in their desperation, began to meticulously document. Photographs taken with an augmented spectrum camera, the SpectraVision X9, unveiled luminous distortions and phantasmal silhouettes indiscernible to the naked eye, capturing the spectral forms of amorphous figures slithering across walls in areas of unusually low temperature. Audio recordings made with a sensitive microphone, the EchoSense M4, captured infrasounds which, according to analyses, correlated with frequencies associated with states of panic and disorientation, in addition to intelligible whispers during moments of heightened phenomenon intensity. Technical analyses of the basement device itself revealed the presence of unknown metallic alloys and quartz crystals exhibiting an altered molecular structure, displaying irregular electromagnetic emissions that defied the laws of conventional physics. Confronted with such phenomena, the human mind instinctively seeks explanations. Theories, like shadows dancing around a flickering flame, attempted to give form to the inexplicable. On one side, skeptics would argue, toxic mold-inducing hallucinations, structural leaks generating infrasound capable of affecting the brain, or the extreme psychological stress of inheriting a dilapidated house, amplifying sensory perceptions. The very antiquated structure of the house, with its creaks and drafts, could easily be the source of all illusions. However, on the other, the persistent and personalized manifestations pointed to something more profound. Some argue that the house had become a nexus of paranormal activity, either through a residual haunting, reverberating the traumas of its former occupants, or by an intelligent entity feeding on the anguish. There is also the theory that Elias Vargas's machine not only accumulated nightmares, but also created a fissure, an interdimensional portal where the barrier between reality and the oniric plane was irrevocably shattered. The truth, however, remained elusive, an abyss of terrifying possibilities. Confronted by the incessant persecution, Márcio and Marise installed monitoring equipment, hoping to obtain concrete answers. A thermal camera, positioned in the main corridor, captured anomalous heat patterns, figures that, though invisible to the naked eye, emitted sub-zero temperatures, moving with impossible agility. Spectral analyses of these recordings revealed an energetic signature consistent with the description of psychic resonance entities found in other cases of infestation. Simultaneously, high-sensitivity audio recorders registered electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, that were clearly not random noise. Phonetic analyses demonstrated that the voices, initially indistinct, when filtered and inverted, articulated coherent phrases, mocking Márcio and Marise's most intimate fears, revealing a degree of intelligence and perception impossible for mere reverberations. In one of the EVPs, the distorted voice referred to Márcio as Professor of Failures and Marise as Advocate of Despair. The correlation between these manifestations and the machine's activity was undeniable. Electromagnetic field, EMF sensors installed around the device in the basement recorded massive energy spikes whenever the visual or auditory phenomena intensified on the upper floors. The machine was not merely storing, it was radiating. The most recent and terrifying discovery was a cyclical pattern. Paranormal activity reached its apex between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., coinciding with the peak of REM sleep, the stage where nightmares attained their most vivid intensity. This suggested a real-time harvesting mechanism for oniric energy, indicating that the house and its entity not only subsisted on ancient fears, but also extracted fresh portions of its occupants' anguish. It was not merely the inheritance of a house, but the inheritance of a problem manifesting tangibly. A psychic infestation demanding more than a mere cleansing or renovation. The great uncle's device, that nightmare collector, appeared to be at the core of it all, a mechanical heart-pumping horror throughout the entire structure. They had to comprehend its operation or how to halt it before the house utterly consumed them. The demarcation between the real and the fantastical, once so distinct for Márcio and Marise, disintegrated under the oppressive weight of that house. Prolonged exposure to the accumulated nightmare energy was not merely a terrifying experience, it acted as a corrosive agent upon their minds. Both began to exhibit severe bouts of chronic insomnia, not solely due to anxiety, but from a paralyzing dread of falling asleep, knowing that the terrors they witnessed while awake would intensify in their dreams, becoming vivid and agonizingly real. Fatigue became a constant companion, marked by sunken eyes and an escalating difficulty in concentrating on daily tasks, profoundly impairing Márcio's teaching efficacy and Marise's legal acumen. Cases akin to Márcio and Marise's, though rare and frequently discredited, find distorted echoes within psychiatric records concerning the impact of extreme trauma. Patients subjected to prolonged events of intense threat and disorientation, such as warfare or captivity, often develop complex syndromes that defy traditional diagnoses. Documented accounts exist of derealization, wherein surrounding reality appears false or dreamlike, and depersonalization, in which the individual feels disconnected from their own body and mind. Certain psychiatric studies on complex post-traumatic stress delineate memory fragmentation and the emergence of sensory triggers that reactivate terror, even years after the traumatic event. In extreme instances, the boundary between perception and hallucination becomes so tenuous that the capacity to discern what is real from what is not becomes profoundly compromised. In their desperate quest for assistance, Márcio and Marise contacted specialists in anomalous phenomena. Many of these investigators, propelled by both curiosity and scientific rigor, visited the house in Messejana. However, what they encountered there did not align with their methodologies. A prominent parapsychologist, known for his skeptical and rigorous approach, was found weeks later in a psychiatric hospital, muttering incoherent phrases about hungry shadows and the sweet scent of anguish. Other specialists simply vanished without a trace, their final notes revealing mounting despair and a complete erosion of faith in their own sanity. The case of the house in Messejana became a grim enigma within the circles of inexplicable phenomena research. The effects of this contact were not temporary. Even after somehow managing to silence the machine in the house, Márcio and Marise were never the same. Their great-uncle's dark legacy wasn't confined to the property. It had taken root in their minds. They carried a heightened sensitivity, perceiving nuances and shadows most people would overlook. A distorted perception that kept them in a constant state of vigilance. The nightmares persisted, albeit with diminished intensity, and the sensation of being watched never left them. With every creak in their new home, every shadow strangely cast by moonlight, they wondered if the terror had truly vanished, or if it merely awaited the opportune moment to resurface from the depths of their souls, to manifest anew. The legacy of the Nightmare Collector was an invisible eternal scar. What few know, and what classified records reveal, is that the great-uncle's machine was not an isolated invention. His research into the transmutation of nightmares into energy had garnered the attention of far greater entities. In the late 1970s, a secret program known internally as Project Chronos, a joint initiative between a cutting-edge scientific research arm and military intelligence sectors, began monitoring Elias. The objective was simple, yet ambitious: to harness psychic energy for strategic purposes. Elias, initially seen as an eccentric, was discreetly approached, and under the promise of unlimited resources for his research, his work was co-opted. Declassified records obtained through internal sources indicate that Project Chronos aimed at creating a psycho-energetic weapon capable of influencing enemy morale or even generating clean energy from human emotions. Elias's Anima Nox Colector was the perfect prototype. However, controlling this type of energy proved more volatile than anticipated. Testimonies from former agents and researchers involved, now living in anonymity, many suffering from lasting repercussions, psychological, detail experimental sessions in which the home's interior descended into chaos. In a bid to scale up the machine's capabilities in the mid-1980s, Project Chronos undertook an experiment that culminated in catastrophe. A massive overload triggered by the uncontrolled amplification of an induced collective nightmare precipitated a containment breach. The machine, instead of merely collecting, began to spew forth accumulated terrors, tearing down the barriers between the honoric and the real. This failure unleashed decades of repressed anguish and dread in a single devastating surge, infesting every room of the Messejana house with palpable sentient manifestations. A massive cover-up ensued. Project Chronos was officially decommissioned. All related documents were sealed, and researchers and agents were compelled to sign confidentiality agreements under duress, facing severe repercussions. The official explanation for the house's incidents, whenever required, invariably cited structural issues or toxic gas leaks. The property remained isolated for years, sold and resold under spurious pretenses, invariably returning to the market for enigmatic reasons. In essence, the house served as a perfect snare for anyone who dared to disregard its history. Márcio and Marise, unbeknownst to them, inherited not merely a property, but the crucible of a disastrous governmental experiment, the repercussions of which still reverberated, and whose true scope, perhaps, would never be fully unveiled. They were merely the latest casualties of a machine that knew no deactivation, only sustenance. Following the events that plagued Márcio and Marise, the Messejana house, though outwardly quiescent, did not remain inert. A new phase of subtle yet profoundly disturbing activity began to manifest, drawing the attention of a select cohort of investigators, armed with the most cutting-edge technology available for the study of anomalous phenomena. Armed with quantum resonance sensors capable of detecting the most infinitesimal fluctuations within the space-time continuum, and neurochemical biofeedback monitors engineered to register real-time cerebral alterations, the team advanced beyond the property's threshold with unparalleled caution. What they uncovered far exceeded any expectation of mere energetic residue. The entity, or whatever the nightmare collector had engendered, exhibited intelligent, predatory behavior. It did not merely replicate fears, it absorbed and weaponized them with surgical precision. In one of the documented incidents, an investigator, a cryptography expert, harboring a latent fear in his isolation, witnessed the corridors of the house stretch into infinity, with doors progressively vanishing, trapping him in a claustrophobic recursion of his own torment, while the rest of the team remained oblivious to the temporal anomaly enveloping him. The manifestations were not random. They adapted to individual psychological vulnerabilities, acting as a predator that meticulously studies its prey before the final strike. The most compelling evidence of the entity's intelligence stemmed from its capacity to anticipate human actions and manipulate reality in a localized manner. On one occasion, the team planned to install a network of protective force fields within a specific sequence of rooms. Even before the plan could be implemented, quantum resonance sensors detected an energetic distortion at the precise locations where the devices were to be activated, as if the entity had already discerned their intention and was preparing a countermeasure. Furthermore, high-resolution drone imagery revealed walls that appeared to subtly shift, altering the house's floor plan in real time to disorient navigators, or shadows that coalesce to form convincing illusions of absent equipment or team members who were not present. The effects on the investigators were unprecedented and profoundly unsettling. Beyond the fatigue and insomnia that Márcio and Marise had already endured, the modern team confronted a cognitive erosion. One of the technicians began to lose his own identity, referring to himself in the third person as if he were a mere detached observer. Another researcher developed a form of prosopagnosia, failing to recognize her own teammates. Even the technologically advanced equipment suffered corrosion, not from mechanical failure, but from a subtle disorganization of its logical circuits, rendering data illegible or distorted with patterns that mimicked nightmares. It was not merely a physical terror, but a war for the mind, where the entity seemed to toy with human perception, transforming reality itself into a prison of personalized dread, a legacy that continued to proliferate. For Márcio and Marise, reality had dissolved into a maelstrom of terrifying visions and sensations. Logic and reason, once their cornerstones, no longer offered solace. Desperate for answers that transcended the tangible, Márcio, with his analytical mind, proposed a more audacious approach: direct communication. Employing high-sensitivity audio recording equipment, which he had adapted with filters to capture infrasounds, they commenced nocturnal sessions in the basement, near the great-uncle's pulsating machine. Silence was the rule, with only the almost imperceptible ambient hum filling the air. Upon reviewing the recordings, initially they heard merely static and peculiar noises. However, with the application of specialized filters, distorted, superimposed voices emanated from the white noise, like the whispers of a distant chorus. The messages were fragmented, yet imbued with a palpable malevolence. Release, hunger, grow, you, part. These enigmatic, albeit terrifying messages proved insufficient. The imperative to comprehend the full scope of what they confronted led Marise to seek assistance beyond purely scientific methods. An acquaintance, dedicated to the study of subtle energies, put them in touch with a local medium, Mrs. Cecilia, a woman of discreet yet respectable renown. Cecilia, an elderly woman with deep, serene eyes, agreed to visit the house on the condition of absolute privacy. During the session, conducted in the main living room, the ambient temperature plummeted drastically. Cecilia entered a profound trance, and her voice, though recognizably hers, assumed a guttural and unnatural timbre. The entity, speaking through her, unveiled its intentions with chilling lucidity. "This house is the womb," the spectral voice intoned. "The birth is nigh. In 3 moons the barrier shall shatter. That which is dreamed shall become real. What is within shall emerge." The entity then prophesied specific occurrences that would serve as markers of its ascension. "The attic mirror shall reveal the truth that conceals itself, and the river adjacent to the house shall run dry for a day and a night." The voice cautioned about the machine's escalating power. It not only amassed fears, but cultivated them, transforming them into tangible manifestations destined to gain autonomy. The phenomenon was evolving, preparing for a larger-scale event, a complete rupture of the boundary between the oniric plane and the physical world. The house served as the point of convergence, but the entity's influence would extend far beyond its confines. The medium's vision was unequivocal. The culmination would be a fusion with reality itself, wherein the city's collective nightmares would materialize upon the streets of Messejana. In escalating terror, Márcio and Marise witnessed the predictions unfold. Precisely as foretold, the ornate attic mirror, once a mere reflective surface, began to display distorted images of crawling creatures and contorted faces that had no presence in the actual environment. A few days later, the small river flowing near the house, which had never dried up even during the most severe droughts, it dawned completely empty, exposing its bed of cracked mud for a full day and night before its waters abruptly returned. These occurrences served as an undeniable warning. No longer were merely the house or the minds of Márcio and Marise at stake. The very fabric of reality in Messejana began to fray, preparing for the genesis of a new epoch of terrors that the great uncle in his madness had inadvertently unleashed. Following the harrowing events that plagued Márcio and Marise, and the medium's predictions materializing with such uncanny precision, what ensued was an escalation that transcended the logic and confines of that house. The entity, previously confined, appeared to have discovered a new echelon of its manifestation, a phase no longer bound by the dwelling's walls, but one that embraced the entire city of Messejana. The most recent and truly terrifying revelation was that the phenomenon was no longer merely a psychic infestation or the projection of accumulated fears. A fusion was underway, and reality, as it was understood, began to warp under the influence of something primordial, germinated in the cellar of that old mansion. The most startling evidence of this new phase manifested in the collective consciousness itself. Anonymous and increasingly frequent accounts from Messejana's inhabitants began to converge. Young children who had never met rendered the same amorphous figures that Márcio and Marise observed in the house's shadows. Adults, strangers to one another, awoke screaming identical nightmare fragments, recounting encounters with entities that slithered from the walls or voices that mocked their most intimate failures. Such a coincidence was statistically improbable, indicative of a mass oniric infestation where the house's terrors were being disseminated and amplified through the city's collective subconscious, akin to a virulent pathogen. Messejana's physical reality also began to manifest subtle yet profoundly unsettling anomalies. Historic edifices, such as the Mother Church of Nossa Senhora da Conceição, appeared for fleeting moments from certain angles to have their spires contorting into impossible helices, or their facades twisting into visages of anguish. The air, previously redolent only within the property's confines, now on particularly quiescent nights, carried the cloying, putrid scent that had become synonymous with the great uncle's apparatus. Local events, such as the traditional market fair, were punctuated by brief, temporal dislocations, during which vendors and patrons reported an abrupt silence, followed by the immediate resumption of activity. frenzied, as if a second had been pilfered from time itself. On certain dawns, the skies over Messejana would display clouds that coalesced into distorted visages or nightmarish panoramas, fleeting yet undeniable. All this pointed to a chilling conclusion. The great-uncle's machine not only collected and projected, but had, in some unfathomable manner, attuned the frequency between dimensions, thereby becoming a catalyst for a gradual and insidious invasion. Nightmares were no longer mere mental constructs. They were acquiring corporeal form, an existence in the physical world, fueled by the energy of fear on an urban scale. The device, that mechanical heart, was no longer merely the epicenter of the house's curse, but the anchor of a grander scheme, a portal slowly and irreversibly opening to a dominion of terror. Márcio and Marise, utterly drained and despondent, realized the battle was no longer for their own salvation or that of the property. The nightmare was morphing into the new reality. And perhaps for Messejana, and indeed for the world, it was already too late to reverse the inexorable consequences. The silence that descended upon the old house in Messejana was not the cessation of horror, but the harbinger of something far more sinister. An insidious transformation that permeated not only the very walls, but the intrinsic essence of everything surrounding it. Although the machine in the basement appeared inert, and the visible specters had receded into the abyssal depths, the true menace had transmuted its form. The air still carried a faint, cloying scent, an almost imperceptible vestige that infiltrated the mind, an olfactory memory of terror that refused to dissipate. Márcio and Marise, utterly enervated, emerged from that ordeal carrying not peace, but an invisible scar, a hypersensitivity to a new stratum of reality that most people would never discern. The manifestations now were no longer grandiose or external. They operated within the realm of perception, akin to a cognitive parasite. Reports from bioelectric field sensors, a technology still in its nascent experimental phase, indicated subtle anomalies in the brainwaves of individuals exposed to the house, including Márcio and Marise. These anomalies were not indicative of mental illness, but rather a pattern of dissonant synchronization, wherein neural circuits appeared to resonate with an external frequency, one impossible to be generated by normal biological processes. Most terrifyingly, high-frequency camera recordings, invisible to the human eye, occasionally captured micro-flickers in the ambient light, as if reality itself blinked for fractions. In a blink, it revealed a chaotic substratum beneath the veneer of normalcy. This suggested that the entity, or what remained of it, was now operating on a different vibrational level, weaving the perfect illusion. The devastating truth is that deactivating the machine didn't destroy it. It unleashed it, transforming it into a spiritual entity, capable of infesting not physical space, but consciousness itself. What Márcio and Marise had done was not to extinguish the danger, but to internalize it, becoming the new conduits, the hosts of a nightmare that now fed on altered perception. They walked in a world that seemed normal, but for them, reality was a thin veil, behind which horror lurked, ready to manifest in the minutest details. The terror was no longer confined to the house, it was everywhere, awaiting the opportune moment to reveal itself to those whose minds were receptive to its new and subtle form of contagion. What would you do to shield your mind from a threat that rewrites reality itself? Subscribe to protect yourself from forces that transcend our comprehension. Activate the bell icon, for every notification could be your final warning before the line between what is real and what is nightmare is permanently erased in your own mind. Are your thoughts truly your own, or are they merely echoes of a nightmare that has learned to whisper in your soul? Thank you for traversing this somber night with us at the portal of dread. Now tell me, would you dare to face this? Share in the comments if you can sleep tonight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell to receive more chilling tales every week. Sleep tight if you can, until the next account. Good night, or is it really?